G'day and welcome to the Patently Strategic Podcast, where we discuss all things at the intersection of business, technology, and patents. This podcast is a monthly discussion amongst experts in the field of patenting. It is for inventors, founders, and IP professionals alike, established or aspiring. And in today's episode, we're talking about software and the convoluted risk-reward interplay between patents, copyrights, and open source. Use of free open source code can be an invaluable tool when building complex software applications. Why reinvent wheels? And depending on resources and budget, sometimes it's the only practical way. But like with most things, free often isn't really free. The cost is just transferred somewhere else. When it comes to open source, these short-term savings can have significant long-term consequences for your intellectual property rights. Can you mix open source with commercial software and still keep your code private? Can you patent your own software that uses open source software? If so, could you ever actually assert those rights? Can you patent open source software that you author? And why would you? Beyond this being one of the most common areas we get questions about when we give talks on software patenting, this is a point of confusion I'm personally and deeply empathetic toward. As someone who spent well over 20 years building software as a contributor, manager, and eventually executive, I came to embrace open source, not only as an accelerant to releasing products, but also sometimes even as a necessity to building solutions that would not have been possible for a small team without leveraging open source libraries that had been in development for decades by highly skilled, passionate armies of OSS developers. Adoption of open source in commercial applications initially started out pretty Wild West, but eventually legal teams started raising concerns, particularly around the use of copyleft licenses, which we'll talk about a little later. But the guidance was legalistically vague, often paralyzing as a developer, and never included guidance around implications for patents. Flash forward to present, and if you look around for resources on the web, you'll find that things unfortunately haven't changed much. This is dangerous, and it's creating a massive blind spot for many startups that aren't having the conversation they don't even know they need to be having around the risk-reward balance of the use of open source in applications that are intended to be commercial, proprietary, and protected with assertable patent rights. For some licenses, if open source is included and combined with other proprietary software, the combination of that software becomes bound by the open source license terms. This viral infectious attribute can have profound implications for code intended to be proprietary and protected. Consequences can include being required to release your code to the public domain as open source, automatic patent licenses for other users of the open source, and an inability to assert patent rights against infringers of your invention. The scope can be so surprisingly broad that it can include both existing patents as well as future acquired patents. These risks are in play whether you knowingly or unknowingly included open source in your software, and whether it was done by your employees or by third-party developers, who understandably love to leverage open source for faster turnarounds and reduced labor costs. The bottom line is that the open source license governs what you can legally do with a particular piece of OSS code. Understanding the associated risks and knowing the limits of these licenses can help inventors navigate which innovations to patent and which innovations to leave for use in the public space. This episode is the beginning of our attempt to shine some light and start facilitating the important conversations startups need to be having around these concerns. Some of these concepts are super muddy and still largely untested by the courts. Further, the answers on your scenario will be highly dependent on things like license type, what you're doing with the code, how you're invoking it, and how it's being distributed. So while there's not yet a black and white recipe backed by case law, there is a lot of gray to at least be aware of, and known potential risks startups should be discussing when using or contributing to open source. It is our goal to highlight some of those risks and provide practical pointers around how you can then apply that knowledge to better understand how using or contributing to open source could drastically impact your intellectual property rights. Kristen Hansen, patent strategist and software patent guru here at Aurora, leads a discussion today along with our all-star patent panel exploring the fundamentals of open source licensing and how certain viral license types can require you to publicly make available your company's source code, how copyrights, patents, and open source licenses differ in terms of software protection strategies, and whether or not, and why you might, patent open source software and often the proprietary code that leverages it, as well as the associated patent right assertion risks that can come with doing so. This is done in part through a working example around using and patenting software that includes OSS and is rounded out by a conversation with practical tips on source code scanning, working with third-party developers, and understanding license-specific implications. We look at concerns through the eyes of both users and authors of open source. and pragmatically as we can, highlight how it's possible to construct a strategy where open source innovation is encouraged without foregoing all future earning power and without blocking others from using it. Kristen has worked both as a software engineer and a software patent agent for the last 2 decades. She's worked closely with software inventors from some of the big tech valley giants looking to utilize open source software while still maintaining their assertable patent portfolios. We couldn't think of a better person to lead this conversation. Kristen is also joined today by our always exceptional group of IP experts, including Dr. Ashley Sloat, President and Director of Patent Strategy at Aurora, Dr. David Jackrell, President of Jackrell Consulting, and Ty Davis, Patent Strategy Associate at Aurora. In future analysis, we plan to go even deeper around the patent-specific concerns of express license grants, which could trigger an implied license of your software for any other competitor software using the same open source library, patent retaliation clauses that can invalidate your use of an open source license should you choose to exert your patent rights on infringers, and how these concerns apply and differ in scope when it comes to some of the more permissive licenses like Apache 2.0, which surprisingly includes both retaliation and patent grant clauses at MIT, as well as the usual suspect strong and weak copyleft licenses like GPL and LGPL. This is screaming for a really nice visual table like we published for foreign filing license concerns. If you have or know of one, please drop us a line at podcast@aurorapatents.com. Otherwise, we'll get to work on that. All right, without further ado, take it away, Kristen.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about patents and copyrights in open source and how they interact and relate. Okay, quick overview: patents, copyrights, and open source differentiation, and how to protect open source software and when you might want to patent something that you will eventually open source. So just to start, let's get some definitions out of the way. The panel here is well aware of all of these definitions, but if we have anyone listening who actually wants a quick rundown in a slide or two that shows you the differences, this is it. Utility patents basically protect the functioning of software. Design patents protect the ornamental aspects or the look of a component or animations or graphical user interfaces. Trademarks are used to protect slogans, brand names, logos, sounds. Trade secrets are to protect innovations that are not patent eligible or not ready for patenting or are more valuable as a secret. And copyright protects original works of authorship, such as software code and unique software code expressions, or music, things like that. Open source software licenses actually are royalty-free copyright licenses that grant third parties the rights to copy, modify, and distribute software code. And these can be the gamut. These are not the exact same protections in every case. They're different licenses, different wording, different language. So you do have to be wary of those occasionally. And copyleft is actually a type of open source software license that requires derivative works, which is anything generated using a piece of that open source software. And it requires that you distribute using the exact same license terms as the code that you're using to create your derivative works. So these can be really insidious, and they can make your software open source for everyone, and they can eliminate some proprietary rights. So if you learn anything from this list of content, be really careful with copyleft. Copyleft tends to be the most narrow and the most difficult to get around. To try to get a patent on something, to try to enforce something that you do have patented because it maybe had a piece of copyleft covered code. It just can be kind of a problem. Okay, so because this distinction is a big point of confusion for inventors, and it's important to understand that some of the open source considerations that we'll later describe, I'm going to go through another way to look at this software versus copyrights versus open source. So when I think of copyrights, I think of protecting the expression, so the actual source code, and of an idea, and to guard against the exact replication of that source code. Okay, when you think of source code in general, you should think copyrights, because source code is not patentable. Only the functionality that comes out of that source code is actually patentable, or attempted to be patentable. It doesn't mean it will be patentable. So patents actually protect the idea and the functionality implemented by that source code. And open source software licenses actually protect the expression of an idea, but function as royalty-free copyright licenses. So again, your open source software is protecting the code in a manner of speaking, but not the functionality. And it's only protecting that exact code. Okay, and the same with copyright. And open source software licensing tends to be something that everybody likes because they get free code, they get a quicker start to their product, they get to, see what other people did, and then they get to build on it. But there are some things that can be problematic about it, and you do want to watch how you're using them and make sure to read all of your licenses. If you're, yeah.
For copyrights with code, obviously you can't, the copyright law also protects against derivations of the copyrighted material. For code, how far does that go? You know what I mean? Like how?
So my understanding is if I were to write that exact piece of code in one language and somebody else wrote it in a second language, it would not necessarily cover that second language, okay? But there are aspects of copyright where the literal code looks almost identical because it will be maybe the same function. And so there are cases where you do have arguments over that, and you do have some wiggle room with saying, well, that's the exact same function, but it's just in a different language.
Oh, that's interesting.
Okay.
I didn't realize that languages wouldn't be covered. But I know they are a different creative expression, right? I know that different languages have very different constraints, more object-oriented versus.
Yes. And so if you have like two object-oriented software tools, you might see them slightly differently, but maybe it's just how it's encased in a for loop. Maybe it's just how, how you're outputting at the end. And so if it outputs different, it's going to be differently copyrighted and copyrightable. If it outputs the same, it looks the same, and you really just have this, little bit of if-then code, or, it's never that simple. But if it were that simple, there is a way where you could get dinged for infringing on a copyright because of something that small. It's highly unlikely, and usually copyright stuff, you're talking about lengthy works. And so it's unlikely that you're going to exactly replicate somebody else's code without actually having that code, right? I mean, you can, but it's unlikely. Okay, so let's look at a quick brief history. So open source kind of came out of the early 1980s with a couple of people who had the concept of, hey, whatever you do or make, give it away for free so others can build with it and make it better. About 1998, I believe the Bay Area is the kind of home of the real open source concepts that we know today. But they had this same idea that said, we want to share it, we want to give it away, we want this to be collaborative and make this all improvable across the board. Okay, so there are two schools of thought. The pro argument for saying that, hey, I really do want open source. I think it's the best way to release software and the best way to do software. That argument is that collaboration drives innovation. And what better way to collaborate, right, than give away free code and let people build upon it? And any of that will drive innovation, but it will also result in industry growth, right? So that's that concept. The con argument for that is that instead of collaboration, they think competition drives innovation. They want everything patented and secreted and not given away. They want to use application programming interfaces of others if they need free software. So that basically means somebody wrote the code, they hid it, but they give you the hooks to use the code to get inputs in and outputs out. So that's covered under this competition drives innovation, because I, as a developer, might have created that API, And I don't mind if people use it, but I don't want to give the functionality away for free. I want to sell it in a package, or even if I give it away for free, I don't want them to know how I put this code together, right? So that's a little more secretive. That is the same as a company creating products that have chips with firmware in them. And without reverse engineering what's going on in there, you really don't know how that firmware works, right? You just get an output, an outcome. So that's the typical way of product development. That's the typical way of industry for a long, long time. But the con argument to that is saying, okay, competition drives innovation, and therefore that results in industry growth. So honestly, I think they're both right, but I think there's a time and a place for both. So I don't know if anybody else has any input on that. I just kind of threw it at you, but
No, because I think I think one can lead to the other as well, right? Because I think part of like the patent system, for example, is to ultimately derive collaboration, right? Because it says I acknowledge, everybody's acknowledging that I invented this thing and I want to collaborate, I want to manufacture, I want to build onto this thing. So, you create licensing agreements and, but I think also open source, there's a lot of people who are just innovating on the side and do different things that, to be able to incorporate their stuff and get a leg up. I think there's a lot of value there as well. So I think, one can kind of lead to the other. So I think, I think you need both, honestly.
I've always struggled with, what's the incentive for open source? I mean, through like the company lens, where I've always tried. I understand as like a greater good, but through the company,
sure.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times,
yeah, go ahead, Ashley.
One thing that I've, heard is like, builds goodwill in the developer community, right? And, even like a recruiting tool and things like that, if you're releasing certain things as open source, or even some companies have programs, or days or parts of days where they tell developers to build whatever your heart desires, like get the creative juices flowing. And those things might be released as open source, but again, kind of a way of, I think, like I said, kind of building goodwill, recruiting, encouraging, employees to be creative. And, so I think that's part of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the other big piece is if you're thinking of your Apples and your Googles. So let's think back to when iOS first came out, and you needed developers to create apps and software so that it could be used. Apple wanted this thing in everybody's hands. Now, they're a proprietor that wants also their hardware in your hands, but that doesn't mean that that's the only platforms they want their stuff to work on, right? So if they can open source some things, they can get those developers up and running pretty quickly and using and creating apps for that iOS software, right? The operating system.
Yeah.
If they can do that, they can sell more apps, they can sell more devices. So it really does drive a lot of things for new technology, right? The same might not be said if you're trying to sell something, I don't know, something open source for an old search engine that nobody uses anymore, right? That might be kind of ridiculous. Also, it might not be useful to not have it open source unless you're going to try to get a patent on it and enforce it. And the other
is a good example of your first one there, Chris. I think that's how, that phone probably too, but I more closely remember the Apple Watch,
Oh yeah.
People to do Apple Watch apps, right? It was like, encouraging people to throw stuff out there and get stuff, so the watch had utility, right? Outside of just being another interface for your phone.
Yep. An early adoption. The other side of the coin on that is what Tesla did back in 2014. And I have a colleague who actually worked for Tesla for a few years, right before and right as that was happening. And he was in the patent department, running the patent department actually. And it was just decided from the top, as you all know the story, they were going to open up their electric vehicle tech and their patents, and they weren't going after people. And some of that also meant they were abandoning large portions of their portfolio and allowing it to just go to the public forum, right? As soon as it abandoned. And that was done to produce industry standards that could be pervasive in others' technology, right? If you think about creating an electric vehicle, it's pretty complex. If three other people have to, pardon the pun, reinvent that wheel, that's going to be maybe three more standards, three more, and at some point they're going to have to standardize. Nobody as a consumer will tolerate four different plugs and, the mini mart doesn't have my plug, right? Things like that. So they did it. It was altruistic, but it was also to drive the industry.
Yeah.
And also from like a data mining sense. I mean, the further it gets out there, the more users, right? The more you're gaining there.
Yep. Absolutely. So there's good and bad. The bad part is people don't get paid for their ideas, and it's a little harder to enforce if somebody's taking advantage of your code, your software, your time. Okay, so basically open source licenses in general, let's go through these a little bit. They do comply with an open source definition, and that definition was something from before that was basically like, put this in the public forum, let everyone have it, and basically publicize your code, okay? It's not just, here you can have this executable, it's publicize your actual code, which means somebody can take it, change it, improve it, and implement something else with it. Open source licenses also allow software to be freely used, modified, and shared, and they must be approved by an initiative. The open source initiative actually goes through a full process of review to get any license that's new. And so what they've done is they've got some standardized stuff. If you've ever seen a new open license, GNU, that's one type of copyleft license that goes out there, and you can write some code and adopt that license for your code, or you can adopt another license. And if you have a new license, you have to get that through this review process. Okay, so there are many different flavors, as I alluded to before, but the following principle is that OSLs do not bar a software author from obtaining patent protection. So you can still go get a patent if you're the author of this content. And they don't bar a programmer from including their patented features when they modify somebody else's software and they distribute it under the licenses, as long as it's distributed appropriately. They don't bar any of that, but they do have statements that say, like, any patent obtained using this OSS content must be licensed for everyone's free use or not licensed at all, which means it's very difficult to attempt to get a patent and then attempt to license that patent. You can still do it. It's just less enforceable, right? There are other reasons maybe to go after a patent for some of your OSS content as an author. And I'll get into those a little bit later, but they just are less enforceable. And not always, there are always things you can do to improve upon what's going on and to use something that I would call is a little bit tangential to the OSS content. So if you create something that could function and execute on something the OSS content made, but it's actually all in itself, its own innovation, and it could be ported to another interface that isn't the OSS interface, there may be some wiggle room there where, as long as your product isn't created on that platform of the OSS, you could have some innovation there that is patentable and protectable. Okay, and we'll get into an example or two of that to make that a little more clear.
Kristen, it's kind of weird offshoot, maybe you'll talk about this later.
Sure.
For a lot of AI, ML, a lot of people, when they innovate in that space, they're using off-the-shelf AI, ML models and creating, using them in a new way. Are typical AI, ML governed by a particular OSS license, or is that in a separate category?
Not always, and often they are not. And it isn't because they're in a separate category. It's usually because when you generate a neural network of sorts to do what you need it to do, you're usually going to need to tweak that. So if you use OSS code for your ML, and you tweak that, but it's still that code, you will be adhering, you will have to adhere to the licensure of that machine learning software because your works are derivative of that. If you look at that, you actually aren't implementing it that way, but you look at it to understand how it works, then you go off and you maybe create your own two-stage neural network that does not function like this. It does not use the code like the OSS content, but you learned from it. I think there's an ethical obligation there that splits. I don't think that you have this ethical obligation to say, I use this OSS content to learn how to create my own content. If you created your own content, you created your own content. Remember, OSS stuff is like copyright in that it is the exact code, okay? And derivatives of the exact code. So even if you're adding a chunk that is a derivative, and some licenses say you have to adhere to my license of my code if you're going to even make a derivative of my code. But if you go off, you do your own thing, it really doesn't resemble this other code, and you didn't start with that code, I don't think you have that ethical obligation, and you certainly don't have the legal obligation. Some people say, well, I got the idea because I was looking at this. And I think that's okay. I think in the patent scope, we do that all the time. I was looking at how they did this saw, and I got this idea to try it another way, and then you go and get a patent on that.
I think
So,
if somebody is using like an ML or AI model, then they might not be able to patent that model. So if it's OSL especially, but they
right.
might still be able to model a way of to patent a way of training that model, or a way of post-processing the data, or a way of using the output in a particular way, which I think more and more, I think, is how machine learning and neural net AI patents are going, because
Yes.
the core models themselves are so developed and sophisticated. There's not and covered already. But a lot of individual specific applications can benefit from different ways to train, etc. Right? So yeah.
Sure.
So
Agreed.
the question, does training change a model enough, right? Because they do, training kind of causes the model to kind of learn a new set of boundaries, a new set of parameters, and yes, you're not changing the configuration of the layers necessarily, but you are, a model that's not trained for your intended use is not going to necessarily give the correct output. So does training change it enough to not be governed by that original license?
Well, if you're not training it if you're not training it the exact way, then it's different. But also, if the code is not a method of training and of training to do what exactly you're doing, right? That's different, I think. If you're going after a method of training in a patent, you likely are not going to claim your actual network. You will likely only claim it as inputs and outputs, because it'll be a method. If it were a device, I still don't think you would claim the neural network unless you're doing an actual, maybe computer piece, something that's actually tangible. I don't know. If
Right.
I
And
would do
actually,
that.
maybe as a individual company or whoever is training a model, maybe what they're changing or developing there is sort of like their own proprietary data set, but the functional code underneath that, the mechanistic stuff is static, more or less. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So moving on. So one thing I wanted to say about this, though, is if you are an author or a modifier who distributes software under this license, you typically can't assert your patent rights against other users and redistributors of that actual licensed software. Okay, so you can't go after anybody else in the open source community doing this with the same content. If the license is written correctly and a little less narrow. You should be able to assert your rights against somebody who is just doing this in the industry, not using this OSS content code. Okay. So if somebody reinvents your wheel out in the industry and you have patented a piece of this OSS code as the author, you can actually go after and assert your rights against these other competitors that are not using your actual code to do the same thing. So there is wiggle room there. It depends on the license language, but it's one reason you might actually want to go after a patent if you are an author of this OSS code. Okay.
Yeah. I think, Kristen, too, if you're using OSS for a to be patented product, presumably that OSS, if you're filing data and that the date that OSS code is made public, those aren't the same, but that OSS code anyways is prior art to your later filing anyways, right?
It is prior art to your later filing. It could be used by an examiner to say, or, by a litigant to say, hey, this is already out there, so your stuff isn't new anyway. It shouldn't have been patented. Or you're infringing on XYZ. But remember, OSS and OSL licensed software is a copyright. So you have to have the patent to go after that kind of infringement because they didn't use your code, so they're not infringing on that license. They would be infringing on the patent that you got. Okay.
It was an extension beyond that code if it pre-existed.
So it's dicey. It's why everybody has questions on it, and it's every situation isn't the same because the license might be different, the code might be the same, but the patent might be different than the code or the actual OSS content, right? So it's not an easy topic. Okay, and like we were saying before, open source content can be and is patented for offensive, defensive, altruistic, and commercial reasons. A patent provides additional control over the software and the underlying innovation. So if you have a patent, you are going to be protecting not the software code, but the actual functionality and what's going on with the software, okay? So using patents, it is possible to construct a strategy where open source innovation is encouraged without irreversibly, foregoing all your future possible earning power, and without blocking others to use it. So that being said, why patent software that uses OSS code and content? Like I said before, the author can use patent rights against a competitor who sells a competing product that incorporates the invention, but that is not a derivative work of the author's original code. So that guy figured out how to do it a different way. You can go after somebody doing that if you have a patent that's on your OSS content as well. Okay, you could not do that with just the OSS content because you only have a copyright. But if you do get a patent to that, you can protect your algorithms in that way. And another way that's protective is altruistic, and that is, okay, I gave this open source content to the community. I don't want anybody coming in telling us we can't use it. I'm going to patent it so other people can't patent it and block my users from even implementing my code. Okay, so it does protect a little bit of the OSS community. It's always questionable which techniques and which aspects are most important to an open source community, right? So like, which ones do I go after on a patent? Which ones do I leave on the table? And like anything, it's all probability and it's all, risks, like what's going to be important in this industry in 5 years, right? And you don't know. So you do have to take some calculated risks if you're going to do patents in this space. And then again, typically the license for open source content only precludes the patent holder from asserting his rights against people who are practicing the invention by using the software, okay? So you don't want to take out your own people, is basically what they're saying. So there's two schools here One is from the perspective of the user of OSS content, and the other is from the perspective of the author of the content. So from the perspective of the user may want to actually defend open source software, like I was just saying. They may go after a patent for certain pieces that they've even added to the OSS software if they can, if the license doesn't preclude them from doing so. They can go after their own patents in this field too. They just can't use them against the community, right? The assertion rights are gone for that aspect. The user of OSS might want to patent content because copyright and open source licenses, like we've just referred to, really are ineffective for protecting software. And I have software code there, but I really do mean software. I don't mean just the code, because copyright will protect your code, but anybody can come by, change 3 words and have different code, right? And get around a lot of things. So a patent would be an effective way to protect some of these innovations. Some of the industry standards around this would be, I guess when Bluetooth came out, maybe, everyone was trying to figure out a new short band wireless tech, and Bluetooth came out and said, we do this, and we do this, and we do this. And there was a handful of other innovations on top of Bluetooth, but Bluetooth comes out to be, like the best of those sort of short range things. So they had a lot of open source back in the day, and because they did that, it was something that was glommed onto by a lot of programmers in the community, and everyone loved it, and they wanted to try it, and they wanted to do it, and it was free, right? And it became the standard, basically pushing out almost every other short technology, except for things that need to work with antennas and RF based technology. Sometimes it's just better to have RF instead of Bluetooth, but it just would have been better that they went after patents to protect that content, because it was going to be so important. And I don't know if they did. I actually didn't look that up. That would be interesting to know if you had open source content over the years where people did decide to patent and it was extremely important and worked out really well for them. So also, you may have code as a user that is not based on the open source software code, the base of that, and that code may have functionality that is patentable, and it may not be subject to the license of that free open software. So if you have pieces like that, you want to consider not putting those out in the public domain, because you may want to keep that for yourself and actually patent it. And a piece of that can be patented if it's different enough from the OSS code and it is not considered derivative per the license, right? There's going to be different licenses and different levels of derivative. But there are pieces out there where you can, and I'll give you an example in a few minutes, where you can understand how, well, that shouldn't be subject to that open source license, right? That's just completely different. Okay, and the other side is the author of the content. The author may plan to license the patent to actually generate revenue. So this is actual licensing. Even if they open source it, and they open source it under a certain actual license that says you cannot patent or you cannot assert your rights, right? If you do patent, they can actually do their own patent on their content to generate revenue and license it proprietarily to separate people here and there. They can open a version of it to the community, and they can make, multiple proprietary versions of it for the non-open source community, and that they can generate revenue off of from their patents. The author also may plan to assert his patent rights against redistributors who do not conform to the license. So if you have a patent on some of the OS content, you might be able to knock out some distributors and some people who are stealing your ideas and not following the license, right? And I call it stealing because if you're not following the license as intended, you are stealing. It was intended to be open and usable by all. The author also may plan to obtain patent rights to use offensively or defensively against infringers who are not using the software, like I alluded to before. If you have people who figured out how to do this on their own, then they can come after you. They can cease and desist on you. They can, if they were first, right? Somehow it turns out your software was released in February and they were out in December prior, the year prior, you're in trouble. So there's good things about patenting open source here and there, and a lot of them are strategic, and you hope to not have to use some of those. But if you do, and you have an important enough piece of your product, or piece of the industry for that matter, if it's very successful, you might want to patent some things. And then again, just as I said before, the author might plan to distribute a non-licensed version of that, which usually means it's quite different. Maybe it has more features, maybe it has fewer features, but they're different features, right? Okay, so let's do an example, because this one will be interesting to get everybody's input on. So let's say you use open source software to build a search engine. Okay, search engine is here in the green. And you design and code up an algorithm that performs searches in the search engine in a new way. So innovation 1 uses a search engine, performs searches, all right? And it will probably display those on a browser, right? And algorithm 2 is for a new way to display search results. So algorithm 2 would actually probably just receive search results from a search engine and then figure out a way to display it on the browser. So do you think either of your algorithms are patentable if they were found new and non-obvious at the PTO? And to what extent?
I mean,
what if one of them uses Chat GPT?
Yeah. How to get that in there?
Does that change anything? Yeah.
Then you're in trouble. Then you're stealing twice. No.
I would say yes. And I mean, if you're not claiming the search engine, I mean, I guess how much the overlap there is between what the search engine does and the algorithm that performs the searches in the search engine, right? Like, I don't know how much overlap there is there, but the new way to display it, presumably, yes. But again, depending on how much overlap there is in the actual search engine versus that algorithm, right? I don't know the lines there, but that would be my 2 cents. And maybe design patent on the display. Right.
Yeah, it seems like if they were new and non-obvious, it seems like they would be patentable. Like, yeah, maybe it's a design in the display, it's a GUI or a design patent, but right, I guess, right, because it's built. They're not trying to patent the code, the OSS code. They're trying to patent something that could be used plugged into a different front end, if you will, right?
Right. That's exactly it. So to give a clear answer, to make it crystal clear, the algorithm for a new way to display search results could be patent eligible because the algorithm to display would simply interact with the browser in order to display some content, and it would only receive actual content from the search engine coded with OSS. It would receive search results. That algorithm actually creates a way to display those and lay those out. And the graphical user interface is actually patentable for utility purposes too. And so the way you're displaying it and the way you're organizing it and the way you're deciding how it lays out is all patentable. And so barring a license that says you cannot use any derivation of my code, you should be able to get a patent on that piece. If the license says you can't use any derivation of this code to get a patent, then you have to make sure you pull all of the code that could have been a derivation of that OSS code, pull it out and make it more generic. And I don't mean make the code more generic, make it work with a different interface, right? Make it work with a different search engine, or make it work with something completely different that isn't a search engine, and you could easily go after that. But most licenses probably wouldn't ding you for that, just because you're receiving content from that search engine. Your new code really does not have anything to do with the search engine itself, except for the parameters of displaying it within frames, right? That's browser related, and it could impact the backend search engine, but it's unlikely. But the first one, the algorithm that performs searches in the search engine in a new way, that would be really derivative, because the search engine itself is the smarts for how the searches get performed, and you've created an algorithm to do that in a new way. It definitely runs on the search engine. It definitely is derivative of the OSS code, right? The only way to do that and get a patent out of that piece that you can fully assert happens to be completely remove it from all the hooks that that search engine would need, right? And then you still might have an algorithm that does searches differently, but you have to make sure it doesn't use any of that code or tie back to any of that code. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. A lot of people do this. A lot of search algorithms are browser dependent and are search engine specific, right? You can't port Google search engine over to an old Netscape search engine, right? They just use different tech, and different algorithms. So there's a way to get both of them to do something, but it takes a lot of work to get number one to get a patent, and it takes a lot less work to get number two to get a patent, right?
Kristen, do you know how this works with plugins? Like, because I would think like a plugin is specific to a particular,
So
proprietary. It's like a Google Chrome plugin. That plugin works with Chrome. That's what it's for. Can third parties then protect those?
yes, third parties can protect plugins, but you have to be careful that you are not incorporating open source code.
Yeah,
And the
sure.
reason you want to do that is because there are multiple ways to avoid open source code if you just need to talk to like the search engine or the browser. And so you're just better off not even searching for it and just sitting down and developing it yourself.
Right.
If you have aspirations of patenting, or patenting in order to license and sell, because your other problem is, if somebody else comes along and patents that aspect that you've figured out, you're in trouble because you don't have protection. They will assert their rights against you. You maybe are also now using OSS content. You're distributing under that license, but you're going to be in trouble for the patent because you're going against their rights. So it's dicey. Software always is, but okay. And the last thing is basically, how can I protect myself when using OSS content? So there are a lot of tools out there that, they work a little like Open or Chat GPT, where they go out and they look for plagiarism, right? These guys go out and they look for content, OSS content in people's code, right? So you can actually run this on your own code to ensure that your developers or your contractors are not using open source code content that you're actually going to put in a product or go after in a patent. And if you are, it takes longer, it increases development time, but you can make changes and pull the open source code out. But you just have to be careful you're not also distributing two different sets of that, and make it very clear which is the patented piece and which is the OSL piece, right? So you could do two sets of software. It takes more planning and thought, but you could do it that way. A lot of companies do actually do it that way. They say, here's a free, cheap, easy way to talk to our interface. And then if you're going to develop your own, they're like, oh, you have to buy our specialized chip, and it's got a communication bus that does this, this, and this, and you have to code it up, and you can't use the freebie, right? So two different purposes. One, to make and use and sell your own product, and the other to quickly get them on board to use their product and see if you like it, right? All right, so key takeaways. When using open source software, understand the license implications. Always read it in full, in detail. Get your highlighter and your pen out. It's important. Understand your rights by reading the fine print that applies to code that you plan to use in your software. And keep code for patentable inventions out of the public repositories if you have patent aspirations. I know this goes a little bit against open source software, but it does not matter. If you are a business person in a field that you want to sell product in, patents are important, and you have to do some of this holding some things back, okay? Remember that open source software licenses implications actually apply to code adopted by a contractor as well. So make sure you're watching your contractors and letting them know not to use open source content. And that's it. Any questions?
I think that's the, kind of goes towards one of the other ones you've done is, making sure your contracts with people specify the fact that you don't want them to use open source and that you do own the code. It's a work made for hire if it's copyrighted, and something that just goes towards, making, in your contracts saying you don't want them to use open source, and then like, so maybe running the code through some kind of checker system at another date, potentially, but at minimum making it super clear that, you don't want open source, or, open source considerations need to be reviewed, or, something like that.
Yep. It happens too often, and people lose the ability to enforce their patents if they went after patents and inadvertently had OSS content in their software, right? The patents are okay. It's okay to go after OSS patented software. I'm sorry, to go after patents for OSS developed content. But you lose assertion rights in certain situations that would have not been lost had you paid attention and just did something slightly different with maybe just a handful of chunks of code, right? It may not even be a lot, but you're in trouble if they're in there and you're attempting to assert patent rights.
That was great, Kristen. A lot of very tangled web, but
yes,
Definitely.
some good check marks to at least go through and try to dot your I's and cross your T's.
Yep, very much.
All right, that's all for today, folks. Thanks for listening, and remember to check us out at aurorapatents.com for more great podcasts, blogs, and videos covering all things patent strategy. And if you're an agent or attorney and would like to be part of the discussion, or an inventor with a topic you'd like to hear discussed, email us at podcast@aurorapatents.com. Do remember that this podcast does not constitute legal advice, and until next time, keep calm and patent on.